I really wanted to take some time to, we've been talking a lot about liberal arts and the core and how to whittle it back and how to not whittle it back, and so that's kind of been the whole kind of dominant theme of the first semester for me at least. And I thought it would be instructive and helpful if you could hear about how we got here in the first place. So I asked Dr. Lee if he would come and talk about that. Dr. Lee was actually on the faculty when we became a four-year institution. And he was one of the many people who was involved in writing the faculty constitution and in writing the mission statement and in writing the institutional goals. And so all of this, of course, was done jointly by a lot of people, but Dr. Lee was kind of the constant through all of those things, along with Dr. Bowdle. And it was actually Dr. Bowdle's passing that really prompted me to go ahead and do this, because you think we've lost a bit of our history, and I want us to share as much of it as we can, kind of as we go through, because we are in another transition. I would say this is like maybe the third version of Lee since I've been here. And so because we are thinking about and getting ready for and going through another transition, I think a deep knowledge of our history is important. And Dr. Lee was not only the architect of a lot of the structure that we now rely on, and the author of many of the documents that really sort of set the groundwork for what Lee is. He was also one of the real thinkers, and I think he'll talk about this part. I mean, he won't talk about himself as a real thinker, but there's part of our history where we're part of a denomination that's not really pro-education and isn't really pro-liberal arts. It isn't really pro-critical thinking. And yet, out of that whole context, which 50 years ago was more intense than it is now, out of that whole context came Liberal Arts University, and so that's an interesting saga, and Dr. Lee was very much part of that from the very beginning. I think we're very fortunate to have people like Dr. Lee and Dr. Bowdle thinking through those transitions now. So I've asked Dr. Lee to come and share that, and we're going to ask you to talk to us as well, and I'm going to probably talk a little bit too.
Thank you, Carolyn. Let me just do a quick explanation. 2 weeks ago today, I had knee surgery. So that was the second surgery on the same knee in 13 months. So,
I think I should do a soft shoe.
So that explains the cane. I'm just going to do a quick overview of the history of Lee College. I assume that most of you have a pretty good knowledge and awareness of the history of the university since 1997. Even if you are newer than that, you've pretty well been filled in on what's happened in these 15 or so years since the university was established in 1997. But I'd like to just do a quick historical overview of the institution that became Lee College in 1947. The Church of God, as a denomination, began the educational enterprise by establishing a training school for ministers in 1918. Now, obviously, this mission was centered on preparing people for vocation, where vocation is specifically identified with divine calling. Ministry, as in the charismatic and Pentecostal tradition, truly something that originates with a specific call from God on the individual life. So it's much narrower than the Martin Luther sense of vocation or calling. And certainly I'm in great sympathy with what has happened in the last 15 years, where we have placed a lot of emphasis on all careers ought to be viewed as callings and ought to involve divine guidance. But originally it was specifically for ministers. Now, this did not just include the pulpit ministers. It certainly included people who did various kinds of missions work and Christian education and so forth, but it was specific calling. Then, as things went along, the denomination realized that they needed to expand what they were trying to do to meet more basic needs. Remembering that most ministers in the Church of God, most of the pioneers, had not even graduated from high school. So in 1930, the denomination established a high school. And then in 1941, initiated a junior college. And this was in Sevierville. Then when the Bob Jones property became available in 1946, the institution was moved to Cleveland, and preparations were quickly made to set up a 4-year Bible college, which opened up in 1953. Well, this was still focused on preparing for ministry, but the junior college obviously included general education base that included some of the basic liberal arts kinds of courses. But even through the 50s, when I was a student here, it was quite clear that the church and the leaders of the institution viewed their mission as to make sure that we had basic preparation for the people who would fill the vocational slots for the church. And it was still primarily viewed as a denominational effort, even though, of course, students from various denominations were always included. When I was a student here, and some of you may not have become aware of this, 1956 to 58, Dr. Herbert Walker was brought in. He was a 29-year-old missionary he was brought to the campus as the dean of the junior college. Now, he was one of the most educated men in the denomination. He actually had 2 master's degrees, and one of them was in sociology. So he taught my sociology courses during my sophomore year, and is responsible not only for my being a sociologist, but also for inspiring me with the possibilities. And I'm sure many others of the great leaders, like Don Bowdle, who was a student here during that same period, received inspiration from these early people like Dr. Walker, who were trying to develop a really respectable institution for the Church of God. To show you where his heart was, he led the effort to move the junior college to a 4-year college in the 50s. We actually graduated 2 baccalaureate classes of liberal arts and teacher education. The first baccalaureate class was in 1958 and the second one in 1959, and it was after the decision was made that we could not afford it, and so the effort was abandoned. Then in 1960, the junior college was accredited by the regional accrediting body. And then in the 60s, a decision was made to get serious about being a 4-year liberal arts teacher education college in addition to the 4-year Bible college. So initially the idea was to have basically 2 colleges sharing the same faculty, the same facilities, the same classrooms, the same campus and joint extracurriculars and all of that. And so in 1967 they went to the regional body, SACS, and asked them to accredit this 4-year liberal arts and teacher education college, as it was called, along with having on the campus a 4-year Bible college that was already accredited nationally by the Association of Bible College Accreditors, and to have these, side by side. And the regional people said, we just don't see any way such a 2-headed monster could possibly work. So they sent them back to the drawing boards, and that's when the idea was to combine it all into one 4-year college that would have 3 divisions. A division of arts and sciences, a division of religion, and a division of teacher education. Now, when all of that was accredited, in the process of getting to our first major self-study and review 5 years later, we had to get serious about the general education curriculum, because you had remnants of the old Bible college curriculum intermingled with the junior college curriculum, And so we designed a general education program that really incorporated what for that time was a strong liberal arts emphasis. We had, of course, to make all kinds of compromises, and one of those compromises being that, you know, you work with the personnel and the expertise that you have. But we set up a general education core that included the pretty standard range, and that was pretty much the core with some tinkering and revisions that remained in effect until the major revision in the 1990s that some of you participated in. Now, I want to go to some of the issues that we faced. Some of them are tangential to our concerns today. The main concern today that I want to focus on is liberal arts emphasis in higher education for Lee versus what I would call vocationalism. But I want to remind you that I'm not using that in the sarcastic, derogatory way that it normally is used entirely, because I have defined vocation as God's calling, so how can I be derogatory about that, right? But you know, my bias, and I want to just go ahead and lay out my bias. My first bias is that the liberal arts emphasis is essential to modern or postmodern quality education. And I have been a strong proponent of the liberal arts emphasis from the beginning. And obviously, in those early days, my role was somewhat circumscribed. I was just, you know, a typical young Turk faculty member who, you know, got elected to the Faculty Affairs Committee, as we called it in the good old days, but the Faculty Council and every other body, I guess, that we had from over the years. I became an administrator in 1978, and by then, of course, the design was pretty much set for what the college would have until we changed to university status. Some of the issues. One is, to what extent should the denomination, which was really subsidizing heavily then, this was the days before the rich alumni, the days before someone like Paul Kahn had developed a network of people through you know, his own contacts that could really ante up if he begged them in the right way. We really had no major donors, and so the denomination, out of the tithe fund. Now, for those of you who are not Church of God and those of you who don't come from working class backgrounds, let me just kind of give you this picture, okay? The Church of God Tithe Fund was money that was sent in by the local churches. 10% of every dollar paid in tithes in all of our local churches, most of whom were not able to pay a full salary to their pastor. And they took 10% of those tithe dollars and sent it in to international headquarters in order to keep the work of this denomination going and expanding around the world, and that included education. And the leaders of the school were ministers who had real inside connections. They were either former general overseers of the denomination or future general overseers of the denomination, and they could go over there to the power structure, the ecclesiastical power structure, and they could beg effectively for big subsidies in order to meet accreditation requirements and to upgrade. And I came in 1967-68 as part of this effort to get ready for accreditation. We were turned down the first time by the Southern Association because we didn't have all kinds of stuff, as you can imagine. We didn't have the doctorate faculty, obviously, is one of them. But so they were kicking in very heavily. Most of these tithe payers are people who never had the opportunity to go to college. Most of these tithe payers are working class or lower middle class, but mainly working class people. And so this money that is being allocated to these, underworked and overprivileged people called faculty over here on the campus, obviously was questioned constantly by the ministers, many of whom, like I say, didn't even get a full salary as pastors, but they had a vote in the Church of God General Assembly. Okay, so that's the picture. So we constantly had the internal political struggle. How do you get people who have not been educated to see the value of investing for future generations money that they work hard for, and that they would rather see go to missionaries, to prepare preachers. When I use the term minister, we all know what we're talking about here, preachers, okay, rather than wasted on this loosey-goosey, humanistic, liberal arts kinds of stuff. So it's a genuine struggle. And voices like Don Bowdle, and then, of course, Carolyn Dirksen and Paul Kahn, and I had a little part to play in that. We're constantly telling our former general overseers like James A. Cross and Charles W. Kahn. And now, let me just say a word about Charles W. Kahn, and this is in no way, it's just a candid expression of my estimation of him. He went to Bible training school, and he worked his way up through the ministerial system to become the general overseer of the church before he became president of Lee. He went to some other schools, but I believe I'm correct, he never had a graduate degree. But he was a self-made intellectual, and I use that in the full sense of the term. He not only produced enormous number of books that were important within the denomination, including the official history, but he was so committed to the importance of the arts and the humanities and all of this stuff that he himself did not have degrees in, but he not only read widely, but he expressed appreciation for, and he was a strong supporter of this during the entire 1970s decade. So that really made a difference. And let me go then to the nub of the matter. Vocationalism versus liberal arts. We start with this emphasis on this school ought to prepare people for vocation, for ministerial calling. Now, from the very beginning, those vocations that were closely related in terms of Christian service got a privileged position. Teacher education was one of those. It was just assumed by Herbert Walker, who was certainly not in education or not an educationist, that teacher education ought to be one of the first majors that we put in. So when the first baccalaureate degrees were awarded, that included teacher education. It included, though, basic liberal arts areas like English and history and sociology, and of course then the basic science, biology. And in preparation for teaching, Christian teachers are viewed, as something essential. And even and one of those things obviously is, well, a lot of our young people in the church are females, and what better for them than to prepare to be Christian teachers in secular settings as well as church settings. And then there were a few other vocational programs, but they tended to be fairly minor unless you count business as a vocational program. Most of the medical technology, for example. But when the nursing issue came up in the early 80s, most of us who were committed to liberal arts felt very strongly that nursing would be a good example of the kind of vocation for Christians that Lee would be well suited, because there would be so many in our constituency. It was still Church of God primarily at that point in the 80s. And so we made this effort to get a nursing program established, which was aborted because the board felt like we did not have the financial resources. And with hindsight, I suspect they had a lot of good reason, because those were the pre-DeVos days, and we certainly, if you see the rundown condition of the science building in the 1980s, you kind of appreciate that. But we have tried to maintain this strong emphasis on the importance of liberal arts, along with the pragmatic considerations for the programs which you could label vocational that are not primarily liberal arts. I want to say where this kind of is expressed in a culminating kind of way. Programs that we developed was the Master of Liberal Arts. It was, in 1998, put in as a graduate program that could not be justified by any kind of mammon-type language like the great job and paycheck you're going to get if you just have the Master of Liberal Arts hanging on your wall, okay? Now, I'll let Carolyn tell you why that failed, but I think most of you know. And that leads then to my final concluding remarks. I think that we have always tried to keep a focus on not only the Christian perspective in general, but also, you know, we must prepare people for ecclesiastical vocations. Not just Church of God, obviously, as we diversified and expanded. Not just pulpit when we say ecclesiastical vocations. But we've got to keep that focus, but we also owe it to the ministers as well as all of the others to give them a solid foundation that includes a liberal arts perspective, the humanities, the arts, the social sciences, and the philosophical parts of the sciences and education and so forth. And I think that has been a thread that's been true throughout the history of Lee College. Now, Lee College started in 1947, okay, so I want to establish that. We already had the junior college at that time. Now, my personal thing, and I have a strong sympathy for and appreciation for voices that speak out clearly and loudly for defense of liberal arts, especially in the general education core. I mean, that's dear to my heart. Throughout this entire history, the majority of our students have not been primarily in liberal arts majors, okay? But we have tried to keep those majors strong and to try to keep them at the focus. But pragmatically, there is a marketplace consideration. We have to take into account the market and what we can sell to the market. We shouldn't. Great voices, I appreciate it, and I've not heard and read all of them because, as you know, I'm just part-time and I don't get to so many of your great discussions. But of course, we must not confuse buying in the marketplace what they have to sell with being able to sell to the market. And one more point. You know, many of the early struggles were struggles of academics to put in quality education, quality programs, in spite of pressures from the ecclesiastical power structure, which I will dub the ecclesiocracy, okay? Now, are we any less threatened if that pressure goes away and is replaced by the plutocracy? So, yeah, we must always keep that distinction between being able to sell to the market versus being able to buy what the market is trying to sell us.